Hey, Michael. Please tell me you can hear me. All right. Let's go to. Can you hear me, Michael? Michael is going to be invite the co-host. Send co-host invite.
Hey, Dr. Brown, I got to go feed chickens real quick, so I may go off our Wi-Fi, but I'll be right back within a few minutes.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay.
All
Thanks.
right.
Hi, Dr. McDowell. I think you got to come up to speaker. Let me see if I can. Dr. McDowell, we need to make you a invite to speak. Okay. So, Dr. McDowell sent you a speaker invite, and let me make sure that Dr. Darity joins us. I am going to go to his. I'm gonna send him a text message. Invite to speak. Dr. McDowell, can you accept the speaker request? Follow you, invite. You might have to turn your microphone on inside of your iPhone, because that's what happened to me last time. So let me go and see if I can grab Dr. Darity. Okay, we are going to. Oh, you know what? Okay, I am recording. Hi, Dr. Darity. Okay, let me see. Invite to speak. Okay. Dr. Darity, I just sent you an invitation to speak as well. So if you guys can check that. I actually think I'm going to make 4 people are listening. Okay. Okay, Evelyn. Can you speak, Evelyn? I mean, 4 people are listening.
Can you hear me?
I can. Yay. Okay, so Dr. Darity, we need to make sure that you can speak. So, okay, Evelyn. Can you speak, Evelyn? I mean, oh, I got to repeat. That
Yeah,
was.
I turned it down. I turned it down.
Oh, okay.
It wouldn't let me. It wouldn't let me. I was on my computer and it won't. I'm hitting join as speaker and it wouldn't let me come on.
No,
So
not on the computer, I don't think. I think you have to be on the iPhone. So, Dr. Darity, if you are on, if you can hear me and you have your iPhone, you should join with the Twitter space on your iPhone.
mm.
So let me make sure I message you too. Please join using your iPhone. Okay, let me see. Okay, he's still saying he's a listener. But I do have him invited. Dr. Darity, you have to make sure that your microphone is on your iPhone. So you go to your settings. You're gonna go to the X app, and then make sure that your microphone is working. Because right now you're still as a listener, and I can see. Hi, Dr. Bentley Edwards. Let me send you a invite to be a speaker, and we can get you up on the stage. And Dr. Darity, I don't. Okay, invite to speak. I'll try and send another one to you. So, Dr. Bentley, okay, I am on my phone, but I can't hear me. Yeah. So you have to be a speaker. So, uh, okay. So Dr. Bentley-Edwards is here. Dr. Darity, I wish I knew what else to do if I was there to, do your phone for you. But you have to be able to accept the speaker invite. And it still has my X app phone is on, but I still can't be heard. Nope, because you're still listed as a listener instead of a speaker. So I sent you an invitation to be a speaker. And what I think I'm going to do is send you an invitation to co host, and maybe that'll help. So send co host invite. So, Dr. Darity, I just sent you an invitation to co host. So you should get a notice. And then if you accept that, hopefully it'll put you in the mode to speak. But thank you all for coming in, folks. We're going to get started in a second. Trying to get Dr. Darity's. Yay, Dr. Darity. Okay, unmute yourself.
There we go.
Yay! Oh, I feel like I'm a X-Men agent now.
Okay, so
Okay.
I'm not going to stay on, but the next time we do this,
Yeah.
then obviously you've got to make me a co-host again.
Obviously, we got to give you the power. Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to respect everyone's time and get started on time like I do for my classes. And
Excellent.
so,
Looking forward to listening.
yeah,
Okay.
okay. So the last time we met, we had a little bit of technical difficulties, and Mansour can't be with us today. His grandma passed yesterday. So please remember Mansour in your prayers. But he will be here for our last Black History Month event, which will be next Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, which is where I'm at in Texas. And so there we'll be doing the second half of the Black Reparations Project book, which features my chapter. But today I asked two of our authors if they would be willing to be features because I was so enamored with their chapters. So today we have Dr. Keisha Bentley-Edwards. She is a physician, and her chapter is in part one of the book, and it's entitled The African disproportionate and unresolved. And it was so fascinating reading her chapter. And I do have some questions lined up for the both of you about that kind of historical harm that we experience being descendants of slaves and how that plays into the Black Reparations Project. And then we also have featured my sister, my support system, Dr. Evelyn McDowell, and she is the author of chapter 9, the part 2 of the book, where her chapter is entitled The Children of Slavery, Genealogical Research, and the Establishment of Eligibility for Reparations. And I know last week, Dr. Darity, when we were having those troubles, we wanted to give you an opportunity first to kind of talk about what you discussed in the second part of the book, and I'll have more time to do in our final Black History Month event, is what we call, what you and Ms. Mullen call the detours of reparations. And we've had some recent events where a few people were disappointed about some outcomes of some local reparations groups. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to reiterate your position because I've actually heard some people misrepresented on here. So I said, might as well go to the source. So I'm going to mute up and allow you to talk about, some of the things you talked about in the book in terms of some of the detours and how we should look to avoid those.
Well, I didn't expect to be talking this evening. I was looking forward to listening to Dr. Bentley-Edwards and Dr. McDowell, but okay. I think that the position that Kirsten and I have taken fairly consistently is that this notion of local and state reparations are intrinsically incomplete inconsistent, and inequitable. They're incomplete because states and localities do not have the capacity to meet the bill that's required to eliminate the racial wealth gap, which is a bill that would be at least $16 trillion, and their combined budgets are less than $5 trillion. They'll be inconsistent because they are sporadic and uncoordinated. And so, as a consequence, there's no attempt to bring them into conversation with one another across cities and states in such a way that they bring together a coherent plan. And they are inequitable because, to the extent that they are uncoordinated and different from place to place, it means that whoever the eligible recipients are, and apparently different locations are determining that the eligible recipients have different characteristics, that whoever the eligible recipients are, they will not all be receiving the same thing. So, this whole movement towards doing reparations or so-called reparations at the state and local level, we think is a detour. There are two other detours we mention in the book. One of the other detours involves the congressional legislation, H.R. 40, which we view as a very poorly crafted piece of legislation for a commission to bring proposals to the United States Congress. We think that this particular form of legislation will not necessarily produce a commission that will get us from here to a comprehensive national reparations plan. And then the third detour is the frequently made observation that reparations has to be more than money, uh, which we think is absurd. Insofar as the notion of reparations plan that would eliminate the racial wealth gap would give the average Black household an increase in net worth of $1 million, which would completely alter the degree of economic security, opportunity, and options that those families would have. So let me stop there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Darity. And as I said, our final Black History Month event is going to be next Monday, and we'll have more opportunity for Dr. Darity and A. Kirsten Mullen to talk about more aspects of, federal reparations and the idea of them involving direct cash payments. But I want to make my pivot. Thank you, Michael, for taking the co-host. I'm glad that worked out. And so I'm going to start off with, if it's okay, I'm going to jump between questions. So you guys can jump in anytime you want to. But I'll start with Dr. Bentley-Edwards since she's chapter 5. Can you just kind of give us an overview of your chapter and then its value toward this kind of, as the handbook indicates, guides or kind of planning for national reparations effort?
Yes, sure. So thank you for including me and my chapter in there in this conversation. Just so you know, my coworkers may try to jump in, so excuse them. No, 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 we had a deal. So, so anyway, oh, and also one more clarification. I'm not a physician. I am a faculty member in the School of Medicine.
Okay,
But
sorry about
it's
that.
no problem. I just want to be sure so people don't start showing me rashes. The and all types of things. People will do things, do weird stuff. But Sandy challenged me on this, and it really, I'm glad he did because it really expanded my understanding of the depth of the and where these disparities that you see people writing about a lot, and myself included, is around health. And then also, as a psychologist, I think about context a lot. What is the context? What happened before? What's going on now so that we can inform the future? And so a big part of chapter 5 was really looking at what happened then to think about how it affects us now. And so, and how this needs to be included in the conversation, about reparations. And so, one key thing, if you don't remember anything else, is to know that our health disparities that we see today are manufactured, right? So they're not accidental. It wasn't something that just happened. This is something that anybody with any sense would expect to happen given the circumstances that we had to move forward in. And the optimistic side of me says that because once you recognize that our health disparities are manufactured, it means that we can also re engineer them so that we can have better outcomes. And I feel that reparations is a big part of that pathway. So, with that, I looked at some of the historical aspects of our healthcare system and how we can find these roots. So, I started with medical experimentation, specifically looking at J. Marion Sims and his experiments on enslaved Black women, most times without anesthesia, and the few times he did have anesthesia was minimal and usually with an audience and without consent. And the reason he was able to do that is because Black people and Black women specifically were not looked at as being as human or even human at all. And so, what's a key point is that when he started doing, once he perfected his procedures and his equipment, uh, he started doing these procedures exclusively on white women, and with that, with anesthesia and consent. So these are really key issues to know that they knew that these were painful things, but Black women were used in the innovation, but not able to benefit from that innovation. And another key aspect, looking into Recon- Reconstruction, um, was dealing with how the disinvestment. So we had this brief period where you had an investment in our well-being, but it was always being undermined. So the hospitals that were being built, the healthcare that were happening, that was happening with during the Reconstruction era, um, the issue is that as they were trying to do these in the South, they weren't allowed to build on the land in those communities to help. And those hospitals weren't just helping formerly enslaved people. They were also helping the people who fought on either side of the war, as well as people who were free prior to emancipation. So they were a glutted system. And there's this idea, a racist idea, that enslavers really took good care, excellent care of the people that they owned. But they didn't. They kept them just well enough because you didn't want them to be too healthy or else they might run away. So when people came out of slavery, they were not typically healthy, especially if they were older. And so there was this big, need that wasn't fully addressed and wasn't fully resolved. And then the last 2 points I really wanted to talk about in the chapter was the training system and how we have these hospitals that were coming, as well as physician training programs, nursing training programs. And with the Flexner report in 1911 that standardized med schools and really is looked at as the modern era of medical schools, existing historically Black medical schools were shut down. So we went from having about 11 to very quickly going down to 5 and then 2 for over 50 years, more than that, really more like 60 years, until Morehouse School of Medicine and Charles Drew were created in the 70s. So these things have long lasting impact, and there is estimation that if those schools had remained open and functioning at their rate that they were existing, we'd have thousands more doctors than we do now that are Black, rather than Black physicians making up 6% of the workforce. They would represent roughly our representation in America, so roughly that 13%. And that's not including those that would go to other schools. So those were some of the key points that I wanted to talk about, and then also the aftermath of integration in our healthcare system. So all of these things inform how we got here. What happened before, how we got here, why we have a small physician workforce in general, but particularly in the Black community.
That
Um,
I'm sorry. That is so fascinating, and that's why I was so excited about your chapter. And so, please hold on to the next thought. I'm
yes.
going to ask Dr. McDowell to kind of give an overview of her chapter. Michael, I see your hand. You know you're a co-host, so you ain't got to keep that little brain. Just jump in whenever
Yeah,
you
I just bounced around.
feel
I just want
appropriate.
to add
Yeah,
I just want to add something to what Dr. Derry said about detours. I think part of the reason that a lot of us, well, a lot of folks, I said us, a lot of folks are getting involved with these local reparations things is that it's hard to allow folks like Narcan and Cobra to inject their framing of reparations without any friction. It's hard to accept that, and I think that's why you see a lot of folks getting involved. Were it not for that, I'm sure a lot of us would just let them go by the wayside, or assure that they're lineage based and included cash and go on about our business. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and we're going to have more time for that on the last day. But thank you for bringing that up because I think it's important as well. So, Dr. McDowell, you can go ahead and give us your chapter overview, and I've prepared questions for all of y'all. And y'all, I'm just learning how to do Twitter Spaces, so I'm gonna try and bring up people with questions as you have them. So, and that's why Michael's here. He better not leave me to go feed no pigs because I don't really know what I'm doing. Okay, go ahead, Dr. McDowell.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for hosting this. And I want to thank my co speaker, Dr. Keisha. I want to make sure, Keisha, am I saying this correctly? You have a PhD as well, Doctor?
Yes, I have a
Okay,
PhD.
all right.
Yeah.
Yes, that
Yeah.
I so good to be on this call with you because your chapter is amazing. And of course, I want to thank Sandy, Dr. Darity, and A. Kirsten Mullen and Lucas Hubbard for putting together this wonderful book. It is very informative, putting together these great authors to give us information I'm sure many of us did not learn in school. So I am very happy to be able to contribute to it because in the beginning of the book we talk about there are four pillars that a reparations program should have, and an eligibility of the recipients is number one. And how are you going to show that you're eligible for reparations program? Is of course you have to make sure that you can identify your lineage to someone that was enslaved. So my chapter, what I try to do is help someone see how to do this. Many people have done it, and it is not the easiest thing to do. However, it is doable, and I want everyone to be encouraged and to try to do this work, not only because of reparations, but you want to do it for yourself. You want to do it because you need to know who you are. I have a saying, you don't know who you are unless you know who they were. And if you don't know who they were, I'm telling you, you have a new awakening happening for you. And this work is very, very necessary. We all need to hear these stories. But my chapter is laid out, and the outline of it is it talks about how to use data to do this work. So the first thing I talk about is completing what's called a pedigree chart. And this chart, and there happens to be a copy of one inside the book. Now, I am a member of or and founder of Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, which is a lineage society started back in 2011, actually. It's for people who are descendants of enslaved people, and it was developed to have us all come together and help each other and help other people commemorate the memory of our enslaved ancestors. It was all designed to uplift our ancestors. And we of course did not know about this reparations program that would happen later. But it's the timing is just God directed. But anyway, the chapters first starts off with establishing this lineal descent and asking you to take a look at this pedigree chart and really start with yourself. You would document your parents, and then you go back to their parents and their parents, all the way back as far as you can, documenting the date of birth, the place of birth, the date of death, the place of death. And it lays out different ways that you could do that with different types of evidence, like Census Bureau, vital statistics, and so forth. Then the next part of it talks about qualifying this targeted ancestor. So once you've identified your ancestors, which one was probably enslaved. So it talks about how to use this evidence to document that your targeted ancestor was in fact enslaved. And I also lay out in the chapter a framework to look at this evidence. Some people feel like you have to get a bill of sale, or you have to identify a will. You have to go and find a runaway ad. What I'm saying in this chapter is that is really not necessary, because there wasn't a whole lot of immigration from other countries during the time of slavery. So essentially, if someone was born before 1865, during the time of slavery, and they were, identified as Black, African, Negro, and so forth, most likely they were enslaved, and I make that case in the chapter. And I also take that framework and use it to talk about case studies. So I have two case studies where we have an ancestor that was born in the South and an ancestor who was born up north, in New Jersey. So, for example, and that's pretty much how the chapter works, and it's laid out to encourage you to do this work.
That is so awesome. Okay, so as I said, I'm gonna do kind of like a round robin because I made three questions for both of you all. And Dr. Bentley, you kind of started off describing my first one. I asked that you really describe what you had called the heavier burden of mortality and morbidity, and connect it to the historical harms of slavery and post emancipation. And the part B of that is you have a lot of schools in the United States that are trying to increase this representation of doctors. One of the things that I experienced with my parents is poor bedside manner of some students, of some doctors who didn't really understand us culturally. And I was wondering, do you have any prescriptive strategies where we can help these medical schools who are offering special inroads into becoming, doctors of the healthcare profession, to pick people who are from our background and lineage?
Yes, so there's a few things that you have to consider. Um, so one thing I would say is that until you can't count on the pipeline. People always say, "Oh, we have to increase the pipeline." It's true, but you shouldn't have to wait, 20 years for someone who's in a pipeline program in the fourth grade to become a doctor. We need folks to be well trained now, both those that are in med school who are um, as well as those who are already practicing and well established. And so there's a few things that you can do as far as protection. And that is you come in with your own advocate. Make sure it's somebody with some good sense, not just someone who's like, let me speak to a manager, but someone who knows you well. Because oftentimes when you're in the doctor's office, you don't feel well. And you need someone who can take notes, listen in, ask questions, do follow up. The other aspect when it comes to the training, or if you had, and I know exactly what you mean, where people are talking at you, but they're not listening to what you're saying, they're concentrating, and especially with Black women, there's a focus on our tone rather than the content of what we're saying. So when we ask about the plan of care, we're looked at as being confrontational when we really want to know, why are you taking this approach when it didn't work last time? It's not so much that we're questioning what you're saying, it's we want to understand it. And sometimes we are questioning, and that's okay. And so some of it is that physicians and physicians trainings has to include how people deal with and manage stress, and particularly around race. And we're starting to see better as people kind of focus on implicit bias. I don't really care about implicit bias. Bias is bias because the outcomes are pretty much the same. So that is important. And then the other point that I would make is that if something happens to that is if something happens, you can file a complaint. And if you feel like you have to keep filing complaints, then you need to make a louder noise. And those complaints are big, especially for the larger health systems. You don't just have to rely on the complaints that occur when you go to the doctors, and then 2 hours after you leave the doctor's office, they're asking you, how did it go? You can talk about it and use that comment section. Trust me, there are people that are paid to read that and do follow up.
Yeah. You know, this,
And then
oh,
and then the last thing, oftentimes med schools, hospitals have advisory boards. um, they usually have patients on there. Now, one thing that they do, oftentimes they'll say they have patients on there, but they're retired doctors. You can be on those advisory boards. So when you start seeing those invitations, you go ahead or you can even ask, do you have an advisory board? You can be on that advisory board and make your voice known. I work with a few different community advisory boards, and those folks are active. And they have a lot of sway.
wow, I had no idea. I'm about to join one when I get on Monday. But
Monday's a holiday.
I know, right? And that's especially encouraging to me because I'm about to be a grandma for the first time, and I'm just so
Congratulations.
thank you, I'm so excited. And the thing is, my daughter's doctor, her OBGYN, was her high school friend, and she was a basketball player.
Lovely.
Now, both of them was from the inner city. They wouldn't come from no particularly elite classes, but I remember her. Friend when they were little always was insistent about wanting to become a physician, and they're both descendants of slaves in the United States, and I'm just so excited she's going to be serving as her OBGYN. But she also talked about something called a dwala. Is that
A doula. Oh, a
yeah, can you
doula.
explain what is that?
Yes, yes. Now, a doula is like an advocate and a helper for you. And I do recommend, if someone is pregnant, that they get a doula to help them with the process. And that's actually one of my regrets, for when I had my children, that I didn't get a doula. Um, And what a doula does is, you have different types of doulas. Some work with you when you are, help you and go with you to your doctor's appointments, especially in the later stages, to get you prepared. They tell you how to breastfeed, how appropriate handling of babies. And then there are some that are in the room with you to help you keep your pregnancy or labor plan. And then there is another set of doulas that are the postpartum doulas that help you with the adjustment, from pregnancy into parenthood. And then from there, you can even have some doulas that help with sleep training to help the baby sleep at night. Now, but the big thing about the doulas and why I recommend them is that they are a set of trained eyes that are in the hospital room, or even afterwards, after you have given birth, they are in the room to say, hey, you don't look right. You need, do you want me to call the doctor on your behalf? Can I ask the nurse to get such and such checked for you? And so you have this extra voice that's in there, and they have gained more respect. Now, this is different from a midwife. A midwife is a registered nurse in most states who is a trained practitioner, and they actually deliver the babies. Um, but a doula and midwives typically deliver low risk pregnancies. Doulas are more of an assistant in the room.
Well, that was so good to know. And I reflect on this recent advocacy all of us have been doing with the OMB. And when I
Mhm.
think about being able to document any particular harms that are happening to us as descendants of slaves and freedmen, having a unique designation could help facilitate that statistical, evidence that we are not receiving the same level of care and or are experiencing more harms as a direct result of our historical, oppression that we've experienced in the country. So that just really made me think a lot about that. But my next question is for you, Dr. McDowell. And I know you talked
Yes,
about,
ma'am.
okay, you talked about establishing lineal descent in your chapter and enslaved ancestry. Why do you think we keep hearing these critiques, mostly of those who are not in support of reparations, about it has to be more difficult? It's too difficult, like slaves didn't have any documentation. And particularly because it is my impression that we're probably one of the most documented Black groups in the nation
Yeah.
because we don't have
in
to
the world.
outside of the country for those records. And those records were maintained in order to forge a system of legalized segregation.
Uh-oh. Can
Oh,
you
you still there? Can
can
you
you
hear
hear
me?
me? Okay, yes, you kind of went out, but
Oh, did you hear my question?
I think I kind of got where you were going with that, because
Oh,
you've
yeah.
rose you bring up some very very important issues,
Mhm.
because you're right. People keep thinking that, or saying to us that it's not possible, and a lot of the reason why folks may say that is because um, that evidence, you're right, there's so much we were property. Our ancestors were considered property, very very valuable property. um, there are estimates that the property value was $1 million, I mean $1,000 per enslaved person. Average value of those enslaved person. There were 4 million people documented as being enslaved at 1865, and 4 million. I mean, those 4 million times a million is 4 billion. But in today's dollars, I think is, Dr. Darity probably would have to. I'm trying to remember these numbers. I think it's 42 trillion is the value of what that same value today, of enslaved people, what they would be worth today. It's an incredible number. It blows your mind, what the value of those enslaved bodies were. And of course it was terrible, even to think about how any country, any group of people could do such a thing for people who are human beings, to treat them that way. Is barbaric and evil. We must say that. But one of the reasons why folks say that it is difficult is because they, in a lot of those cases, I call them, if you read my chapter, I have a category where I put different types of evidence, and I call them this is level 3 evidence. This evidence was created in a world where human beings, just like you and I, were valued as property, and they didn't use first names in a lot of cases. I'm sorry, they only used first names. They didn't use any last names. They described us as muddy complexion. They described us like we were were subhuman. And I call that information, that evidence. I call it level 3 evidence because it was developed in this world where this barbaric, sick world where people were devalued. Um, but there are other evidence. There is other evidence that you could um, use to first of all track and find your ancestors. So your mother and father, of course, you have a birth certificate. Your mother and father had a birth certificate. You probably your grandmother and maybe even your great grandparents have birth certificates. So getting back to 1865 in a lot of cases is not as difficult as you think they were. In my particular case, my great grandmother was born enslaved. So it's not, slavery wasn't that far away. And in order to get back to that person, I just use I in a lot of cases I use the census records. They're extremely helpful to get to get back that far and to see that my ancestor was born in 1865. Actually, she was born in the 1850s. And and I talk about how, because there wasn't a whole lot of immigration, probably almost nothing, in terms of people coming here during slavery. People were coming here during slavery from, of African descent to be enslaved. So there weren't people coming here for vacations and to see what the new world was like. I'm sure there were, but those numbers are pretty small, pretty low numbers, at least documented. And because of that, if you found a person, let's say, who was born in 1865, and you go back to the 1870 census, they're not there. You go back to the 1870 census, they're not there. But they were born in, let's say, 1850, or they should be on the 1860 census, and you don't see them. And then in a lot of cases, especially in the South, they were actually kicking out the free people. There were laws on many of the books down in the South that said, if you are free, you will, if you stick around, and we're going to re-enslave you. So, if you have an ancestor who was born at that time, after those laws were passed, most likely they were enslaved. So, what we're saying is you can use a lot of negative evidence to help you make the case that your ancestor was enslaved. So, and even if you do want to use that other evidence, the evidence, runaway ads, wills, land deeds, where they're listing people with the first name and no last name, you can still use that evidence. But in a lot of cases, that going back to that type of evidence is not necessary.
Dr. McDowell, I got so excited when you were speaking on so many levels because my graduate students and I have used Twitter Spaces to examine how one might deliver and educate adults using social media. And we actually got an article that is going to be published in Dialogues and group of black folks called Fisher's Negroes. Now, they were manumitted by Fisher upon his death, and he actually left them land, money, and promised to live on his plantation for 15 years and equipment and stuff. And what happened is that his nephew circumvented that bequeath, and the Supreme Court supported them undermining them. So they never got the reparations. And in fact, the Tennessee Supreme Court said that what you can do is migrate to Liberia. if you want to stay free. They didn't even
Wow.
want them in Tennessee with these, bequests that were given to them by Fisher. So that'll be in our article. I'll talk about that. And the other thing you reminded me of is I was blessed enough to know my grandparents and my great grandparents, right? On both my parents' side, except for on my father's side, because his grandfather was killed in an industrial accident at Goodrich Rubber Company, and it looks suspicious. But it goes back to what you're saying about documentation. They documented on his death certificate his race, the how he got killed, and then I get into stories about how they were able to get their house as some kind of like settlement and stuff like that, and jobs were promised to all his sons. So it is fascinating when you have family members who you can go back and get information for. And I'll say one more incident to support what you just said. I have a cousin who is still alive. She's the same age as my dad. And her great grandfather fought in the Civil War, right? She gave me so much information. Now, when I found him, he was a tally mark in Gwinnett, Georgia, right? Because, they didn't put the names. But the slave owner named him after him. So he was named after his master. So I found him, his mother, and his sister who looked like he passed away. And I was able to track him being sold from Georgia to Mississippi to be a part of the 58 Colored Troop Infantry. So it's just really fascinating that, when you have these family members who can kind of give you these, markers, and then the librarian at the local library in Akron helped me as well. So I just wanted to talk about that claim because a lot of times you hear people who are opposed to reparations say, well, hey, slaves don't have any history, and they'll say that now we don't have any
Wrong.
history. Now those black history laws. But
Hmm.
we have quite an extensive history that
Hmm.
is supersedes a lot of people who have European ancestry in here in terms of its extensiveness.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
So we are
Hmm.
going to take questions at some point, y'all. But I did have three questions for the author. So if you have questions, you know, uh, just give me a few more questions for them, and then we'll open it up to take questions. But Dr. Bentley, in your chapter, you talked about how people undermined the medical schools and the hospitals that were created as a result of the Freedmen's Bureau. And I was just, really taken aback by how people just interfere with being certified. It's just always this like, why do you spend so much effort to oppress people and, and just disrupt their ability to, just seek a life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right? Yeah, I mean, these medical schools were serving communities. They were strong in terms of preparing doctors. And like some of the things you talked about is people who were in authority on these what they call medical certification agencies that were either not granting certifications or interfering with people.
So yes, um, so no, and this is important, and it has implications for today too. But I'll talk about what you brought up first. So I mentioned earlier the Flexner report, and so this was something that was commissioned by the Rockefeller Foundation because med schools were all over the place. Some of it was, you got to remember, medicine is a fairly new field in the world of all the different types of sciences and fields of study. Um, and it was part of making medicine and being a physician professionalized. Um, and so, with that, Flexner was commissioned to go around the country, inspect med schools, and come up with this is what is needed, this is what the education should look like, this is what's required. And with that was also saying, was part of it was discrediting um, schools that were in existence. And it wasn't just Black med schools or physician training facilities that were discredited, but the impact was so severe on those that were training Black people. And so, one of the places, so you had Meharry and you had Howard that survived. as far as physician training. But if you were to look at what Flexner said, it wasn't they those weren't kept open because he thought that they were going to train excellent black doctors. They were kept open in order to control disease so that black people would not spread disease to the homes, to the white wealthy homes that they worked in. And so they wanted them to be more like sanitariums, is what they would call them. So places that they could teach hygiene. Now, obviously, that's not what happened. They still were hospitals and training doctors. But the problem is that if you were already a student at one of these schools that lost their accreditation, or were told that were no longer a valuable, providing a valuable education, it meant that you couldn't work anywhere else, right? Your degree meant nothing all of a sudden. And so people were leaving those schools, but also even if you were at graduated from someplace that was accredited, because our hospitals were so segregated, even in the north, in the south they were separate facilities, but in the north it was might be separate floors, um, still segregated. You couldn't get a job. And so so these things become critically important in contemporary times, when we look at research that was done a few years ago looking at doctors in Florida. And we were talking earlier about infant and maternal health, and what the researchers found for when it came to infants is that black doctors, and it's something that they call racial congruence, and that's when the doctor and the patient come from the same racial background. And so they were studying to see how that affected whether or not babies died in their first year. So, what they found is that when white doctors were taking care of white babies and black babies, their rates of death, so how many babies died, is what you see in the national average. When black doctors were taking care of white babies, you saw that their rates of death, which is pretty low, was also similar to what white doctors had. But when black doctors were taking care of black babies, you found that those black babies had a much lower likelihood of dying. So they had a better success rate in keeping black babies alive. And that is something that we really have to look at. So when I talk about how we need to have a stronger black physician workforce, this is what I'm talking about. There are numbers that point to it. So it's not just like, oh, I just feel better and I'm more comfortable. This gets back to the quality of care. So, what it's showing is that the Black doctors are giving their Black patients the same quality of care as the white doctors. And that's what's important. Whether it's because the communication is better or they're treating them better, they have a better bedside manner, it doesn't matter. They're getting the better quality of care that they're able to give. They don't have the black doctors didn't show that they had a problem of when they were working with white patients. But the
That's
white, you understand what I'm saying?
Oh,
So the black
absolutely. I
doctors
mean,
are
I think
keeping
that
the babies
across the
alive.
board, yeah, I think across the board in terms of being empathetic and humanity. I mean,
Hmm.
I think there was like some study about people saying if children are lost, to find a black male because they'll take care of them. That white mothers are telling their children, or white parents are telling their children, if you ever lost, look for a black male because they knew that that person would get that child to safety. I saw that recently. And it kind of also pivots me to the Tuskegee experiments and how recently I read that they were offering as restitution, certainly not reparations, college scholarships, and how inadequate that is in terms of what happened to that group. And I was just wondering if any of the authors had any thoughts about that, and in terms of it not being reparations. I mean, you
Oh
have
yeah,
folks.
it's definitely not reparations.
No,
And so one thing I do want to say is that it's a gesture is probably the better way to put it. It's not reparations. And part of it is that when they paid restitution to the Black men who were allowed to have untreated syphilis for 40 years. um, they paid a small amount of restitution to the men and maybe to their families if they were no longer with us, but they did not give restitution to the family members that were also affected. So you got to remember that people had syphilis and were had untreated syphilis even though penicillin existed, right? And we knew that it was effective. So there was an effective treatment that existed for several decades. And these through a concerted and collaborative effort, these men were not provided that treatment, which meant that their any of their partners, sexual partners, also got syphilis and were exposed to syphilis. That children were born with congenital syphilis. There was an after effect that went way beyond just the men who were part of the study. And that's what they are talking about with these scholarships to their descendants, is to acknowledge that the harm affected other folks, but because they've already settled the case, that case is considered settled. This is really a gesture of acknowledging that, you know what, we did wrong. And it affected more people. So I don't necessarily have any negative feeling towards this gesture, but because ultimately people are getting scholarships. I wouldn't call it reparations. I would just call it a gesture. But I'm
It's a
happy to hear other people on
Yeah.
this one.
it's a meager gesture, a very meager gesture.
Yes. Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay. And so this is my last question for the doctors, and I think this could go to both of you because both of y'all talk about DNA. You hear a lot of people talking about DNA. And from your perspective, Dr. McDowell, I understand DNA to be more of a function of being able to exclude, not necessarily to verify that a person has a slave ancestry. And I say that from this perspective because of the shifting regions under which a person might identify where someone came from. Like some of these commercial tests, they do not allow you to say, this is where you're from. And that the profiteering associated with it has been somewhat uh, unscrupulous at times. But at the same time, I know it has some exclusionary power. So I wanted both of you all to talk about the role of DNA as it relates to lineage identification and also how sampling can inhibit that as well. If you don't have a sufficient sample of persons from a particular group, how can you justify saying that you're from this particular group?
Well,
That's a
okay.
headline, I guess.
I'll jump in on that. So I will say I am not a DNA expert in this field, but in this way, but I do have some experience with it. And you're right, you can't at this particular time we can't really say by itself, you can't take
Mm.
a DNA test and say I am a descendant of an enslaved person. I mean, you could use that as evidence to support that you may have been or you're a descendant from an enslaved person, but it doesn't tell you who that person is. Okay, so now you can use DNA to corroborate some of the information. So for example, your DNA on different segments. If I match up, if you and I, Dr. Brown, match up on a certain segment, and then you and I both do our family tree. So we keep going back on our family tree, and I can tell you that I've met other people who match on this particular segment because they were a descendant of so and so ancestor. Now, if you and I take a test and you match up on that same segment, then I can say, hey, with some a surety that you are probably also descendant from this same person that other folks that I know are descendant from this particular line. So you can use that in conjunction with a family tree and certain segments on your DNA to most likely connect yourself to an enslaved person. So it's possible, but it is corroborating evidence.
Doctor, I've been on this for a while. I mean, I understand a lot of people don't want to deal with DNA, but I think I view DNA. I view our lineages as a map,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how people understand maps is experience, right? So if I know a particular area well, and then I know a separate particular area well, those connecting pieces become easier. You see what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that once, especially when all of us get on board and start, because we all descend from the same base, most of us descend from the vast majority of us descend from the same 4 million people. Once we start doing our lineages as a group, and I think DNA will be valuable for closing gaps, like for adopted people and for people who were orphans and so on and so forth. Does that make
I
sense?
agree. I
I,
absolutely.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I also want to comment a little bit more on that because my undergrad is in biology and chemistry, and I'm not a PhD, so I tend to stay away from it. But I think it's important for us to understand there's no such thing as a race gene. There's no such thing as a race allele that presents itself as characteristics on a gene. It's what Dr. McDowell talked about is it can corroborate the documentation that someone could easily be your cousin because of those similarities. But it can't say that your ancestors came from a certain place in Africa or a certain place in Nova Scotia or a certain place in Antarctica, because the parameters by which you would make these associations are not stagnant. They're dynamic. And you have tribes and people who migrate around where you might not necessarily be able to do those matches if you were to compare someone there to someone here. So that's the thing that I wanted to highlight because I hear a lot in these Twitter spaces. Well, race is just a social construct, but it's a social construct with real material implications.
Dr. Brown,
Science that people,
I'm so happy you said that because that is um, um, people get very confused when you talk about race being a social construct,
yes,
and it's like I look just like my parents, but or I don't look like all those things. And when we talk about race being a social construct, look, I don't know about your family, but in my family we have folks who are very dark and who are very light and in some ways can be white passing, but we all count ourselves as black. And when we talk about, and one thing to be clear about when I talk about black people, um, black babies being twice as likely to die, it has nothing to do with them being, it's not their black being black. That is not their skin color that's making them die. It's the social reality of what it means to be seen as black that is causing these disparities. It's not in the DNA. It's not a genetic predisposition to death and sickness. This is manufactured.
yeah.
That's the one thing I do want to make sure that we're clear about. We are talking about a prevalence and not a predisposition to disease.
Right. And the other thing, I'm a mixed methodologist, so I use both quantitative and qualitative research. And I don't like how people privilege the natural sciences over the social sciences. They're both sciences. One is just natural science and it operates from a particular paradigm of reality. And the other one is social science that takes into account the complexity of human beings and how we interact and socialize and determine what's valuable and what's not valuable. So I just wanted to mention that as well because I hear a lot of people saying race is not real. It's the social construct. It is, but most of the things that we engage in civil society is socially constructed. We present and create value for them in the context of power. But I'll talk more about that when I do my part. But I just wanted to mention that before we got away from the good doctors. And so, Michael, can you help me with trying to get people up who have questions? Does anybody have any questions or comments they want to make?
Yeah, I'm on it,
Okay.
Doc. I did. Fahima requested. I did allow her up, but she didn't come up. She's a old school dark and combo
Oh,
person.
okay. Well, I mean, if anybody wants to make comments about what they heard or their thoughts, you can do that as well. You don't necessarily have to have a question. I hope y'all enjoyed this. This is really important for me to do this during Black History Month because I told you after Christmas, this is my favorite time of the year. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Bentley-Edwards and Dr. McDowell for doing this. I really, really appreciate you all, being willing to be our featured author for this event.
Yes, thank you so much because I learned a lot.
Happy to be here.
So,
And
hey, Mama, how do you put something in the jumbotron? I wanted to try that.
If you go to whatever tweet, first you have to do a tweet,
Okay.
and then when you click the share button in the bottom right corner of
Uh
that
huh.
tweet, you'll see at the top of that box that pops up, it'll be the title of the room,
Ooh.
and you click on that, and that will put it in the
Okay, I'm
jumbotron.
gonna try and do that.
so while you're waiting, I want to make a commercial for people to please do this work. Do this work not only for reparations. I have learned so much about myself and who I am as a person who presents as African American. I am African American in this country. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I learned very, very little about slavery. I learned very, very little about the history of my people in this country, and learning about slavery and
I'm
yeah.
sorry, Dr. McDowell. Dr. Brown, can you close your mic? We're getting a lot
Oh,
of feedback. I'm
sorry.
sorry.
Okay, let me get that. I'm not doing too good with this jumbotron thing. It have to be another time.
Where is it? Send me the tweet in the DM. I put it up there.
Okay. So learning about my ancestors and tracking or tracing them, I can see the real history, the actual history of our ancestors in this country. We talk about redlining. Well, I can see the redlining, and I can see where people were born, and I can see how that affected my family. We talk about the GI Bill. My father was a Montford Point Marine, which I had no idea the significance of that. These people were the first um, people of African descent to be accepted in the Marines. Was a 146-year history, and my father was one of them. I had no idea, and he could not use the GI Bill to help him and his family. And we talk about how racism affects African Americans. I saw it firsthand, and you can see it for yourself. As this is Black History Month, and we bring out, of course, our wonderful, ancestors, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. But each of you all have those people in your ancestors, your family tree. Your ancestors have done amazing, significant things. You don't know about them because you don't know who they are, and you can't tell their story, and you can't energize us and by hearing those stories because you don't know them. So you need to know who those people are. You need to tell their story so that you can encourage all of us. So I want to tell you to do this work not only because of the reparation. It is very important that we get reparations for what our ancestors endured in this country, and the wealth that was stolen from them. The wealth gap is because of what they did to our ancestors. So this we will never be able to catch up if we don't have reparations. We have to have it. So doing this work is important for reparations, but it is, I think, even more important for understanding our true reality and who we truly are. Because I'm telling you, you have been lied to. If you grew up in this country and you didn't have education about enslaved people, and you missed all that, or you learned very little, I'm telling you, you have been lied to. I learned that a half a truth is a lie, In our case, it's 0.2250 truth is a lie. So you got to know the truth of who you are, and the only way to do it is to do this work. Sorry for my this
No,
is
no,
I'm
no.
very
You
passionate.
you got no. You got the amen corner over here. And it's so true. And look, whether your your ancestor was the first and to break down barriers, or they got you here, they survived so that you could be here. All of it's significant. Um, one of the things that I feel doesn't really help us is when we always only assume that, oh, we came from kings and queens. Yeah, but we also came, from domestics and housekeepers, um, and from folks. My grandfather was in the military too. Um, barbers, all these, they survived so that you could be here, right? So that's important. But also, since I'm coming here from a health perspective, I also want you to start asking about your family health history. Oftentimes we don't know what's going on. We don't know that we have family members that are cancer survivors or who suffer from heart disease, or anything else. And it's important, especially if you plan on being here for a while, if you plan on living a long life, you need to know. And the reason why you need to know is that that's part of how you're empowered in the doctor's office, and where you can say, hey, pay attention. I have a cousin who died, from heart disease in their 30s. And so when I tell you my chest does my pain, I have chest pain, I need you to take this seriously. Or I can talk about having an aunt and a first cousin who have breast cancer. You need to take this seriously. And so that's why you need to actually ask what some of those uncomfortable questions to your family members, so that you can be empowered when you are in the doctor's office.
And can I follow up on that too? Because another part of doing this work, you can actually pull the death certificates of many of your ancestors, and you will find that there may be some common ailments. For example, in a line that I was studying for someone else, we saw that this person's line, that people were dying of kidney failure, and sure enough, the kidney failure was prevalent in this family, and it went back for at least 100 years, that we could see that the reason why these people in that particular line they were dying. And I do want to just also just say yes, that this history about the Tuskegee experiment. I want to just mention my brother, God rest his soul. He just died not too long ago, and he died from something about not being. He didn't want to take his blood pressure medicine, and one of the reasons is because he didn't trust the medical the medical world, because of how Black people have been treated in this country. And he just didn't. All his doctors were of European descent, and he didn't trust them because he didn't think that they had his best interest at heart. So he tried to medicate himself. He would be here today if we did not have this terrible history of people in our society treating us like that we're not even human, that we've got different bones than they have, and we can tolerate pain better than other people just because of the color of our skin. Actual medical people believe this stuff, and so it's scary world for many of us to go out and try to get medical attention, because we don't know if that person was at a Trump rally last week. So
Yeah.
it's a really hard situation for us.
And I want to add a piggyback on to what you said, Doctor Nadal. It's not just the color of our skin; it's because we are descendants of slaves. I definitely believe that there's a certain degree of associated inhumanity that gets carried over and transferred because of the propagandizing of who we are in the context of the United States. Because y'all know as well as I do, it's folks that's darker than us, and that they are not going to be perceived the same way just because their skin is darker or the same complexion. There is a unique framing of who we are as descendants of slaves that we have not rectified in terms of how we presented the Black American story in the United States.
Well said.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. I'd like to add to that that brings up my uncomfortable thing that I often bring up in these spaces is that just as you said, Dr. Brown, just having a black face in the doctor's office is not enough. You know, bringing in doctors from overseas is great, but we need to build our own doctors from our communities to talk to us about our ailments, and that has to be a big part of how we move forward in the
Or
future.
it needs to be a
It's
condition of you becoming a doctor that you show evidence of
absolutely
your
for all doctors,
sympathy
absolutely.
toward these particular groups. Because these people are coming here with very little education about our history. And so they buy into some of the negative stereotypes and tropes that have been presented about us.
Absolutely, we see it every day. We have a guest on the stage. Would you like to go to Fahima, Dr.
Sure, and I'm
Brown?
going to let you do that because I'm not doing it.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you so much. Thank you so much. I was going to ask if I could get into the queue. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. My name is Fahima Sek. I hail from New York City. And I just wanted to share something that I placed in the timeline. It may or may not be relevant. But when I was a graduate student at Howard University, there was a geneticist, Dr. Rick Kittles, who worked on the African burial ground, which was uncovered in New York City, my hometown. He worked with Dr. Michael Blakely, who was a cultural anthropologist, and he also had the opportunity to work on the Human Genome Project during the turn of the century. And one of the things that he gleaned from working on these two projects was the opportunity to develop AfricanAncestry.com, which enabled us to discover something that we were not supposed to be able to. Because when our ancestors were kidnapped from Africa, we were never supposed to know where exactly we came from. And AfricanAncestry.com, and I don't work for AfricanAncestry.com or anything like that, but I'm just sharing the information. The mitochondria DNA allows us to ascertain and determine where exactly we came from, where on the continent, what community of people we came from. And I just shared that in the timeline because that I think it's relevant and it's something we were not supposed to be able to ever find out. And I'll land there.
Okay. Dr. Fahima, thank you so much for your comment. I think you may have left the room. We kind of went into a little bit of discussion about the inability of using a racial marker because of a variety of reasons. One of them being the geographical patterns that have happened over the centuries in order to do that. Plus, there's no such thing as a race gene. There's no such thing as a race allele or marker. And the other thing, too, is there's some other research, and I've been trying to get more into it since I'm not teaching science classes anymore. I don't really cover it as much, but they've actually found mitochondrial DNA that was retained in the tail of the sperm. And so when we have always thought that mitochondrial DNA was the only DNA being transferred to the fertilized egg, there are some research studies that show that some of the paternal mitochondrial DNA, not mitochondrial, yeah, mitochondrial DNA is retained in the tail of the sperm that fertilize the egg. But don't hold me to that because, like, that's not my area of expertise. But I did read articles about that.
If I may, I'm the least qualified for this discussion. But one of the things that we also discussed with him was that we our lineage, the DNA is helpful, but we need to close the gaps here in the United States with those of us that descend from chattel slavery here in the United States. I think those gaps for the discussion of reparations are more important to close than those outside of the United States.
Good point. Actify Press. Do we have any other people who want to speak?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to kind of like piggyback off of what was just said by the last few speakers. Well, first of all, let me say when it comes to genealogy in conjunction with DNA, there is some there is some use for that. For myself, I did my mother's lineage, and I found that it took us to Mississippi and the Carolinas. And when my aunt, my mother's sister, when she did DNA test, that's exactly what it found on for the regions for her communities, and it linked us to other family members and people that are related to us in those regions. But when it came to the actual like regions of ancestry that like supposedly thousands of years or whatever, it gave us the usual Nigeria, whatever, and other places. But I did a deep dive myself on how do they come up with these percentages. And I think the problem is people, take take it for face value and don't do the research themselves. These sites, they have white papers that you can check into and see how they get the estimates. And basically one of the main way they get the estimates is they survey someone from a region, right? So say they survey people from the Yoruba tribe, and they interview them and they ask them, how long have you been living there? Were your grandparents living there? So on and so forth. And then they take that person's sample and they set it as the panel to be compared to. So the and this is just for ancestry.com. So with that being said, they're saying that people can only trace about 3 to 5 generations anyway, and those are the people they're using for panels. So we got 3 to 5 generations here easily. So why wouldn't we be used for those panels? It's just not logical. You know what I'm saying? So when we think about why is this such a big business? Why do we need to see these pre-colonial ancestry places? It just doesn't make sense when we're skipping over history that is about 102 years, out, that we can really identify with. We can see names, we can see places, we can see tangible things and connect to real people. So I just wanted to bring that up too in regards to DNA testing.
Thank you for sharing that,
Dr. Brown, can
Jubilee.
I just respond? Can I just respond briefly,
Oh,
please?
sure.
African AfricanAncestry.com by Dr. And again, I'm not affiliated with them. The only connection is I was a graduate student at Howard when he worked on the Human Genome Project and the African Burial Ground. AfricanAncestry.com was the very first such entity. All the others are knockoffs. And the thing is that again, they were the very first, and then you had these other companies that came after them. AfricanAncestry.com actually, as I mentioned, he worked on the African Burial Ground that came out of New York and the Human Genome Project. And they do not sell your DNA, they destroy it, and they're using mitochondria DNA. They're not sampling people from the continent and seeing, oh, well, let's see if there's a match. They have the largest repository of African DNA in the world, and all the other companies are knocked off. I am not affiliated with them. I don't have stock in the company. I'm just sharing the
Well,
information.
as soon as you get a court case of people want using them, please post that in the jumbotron because I would love to see it. But I wanted to say something else about what you said, Jubilee. Uh, is it a Jubilee? I'm thinking the church. The the fact that in the United States, what happened to us here is so understudied from a sociological standpoint because a lot of people don't know W.E. Du Bois is held as the father of sociology. See, we've had all of these historical studies, but we are a unique kind of petri dish in terms of our experience because you can have one parent who is of a completely other race. So you just erase all of that influence on who you are biologically? No, you wouldn't do that for health reasons. If you know that your father's grandfather, if he was white and had ALS, you would want to know that. And so I think when we start getting into these more aspects of trying to use the social construct to identify ourselves, that we get into slippery slopes versus using them for purposes of medical purposes and confirmation of relationships that may be more direct, like a father and a son or a father and a daughter. So that's my thoughts about that. But I mean, yeah, we're scholars, so all we say to any of these things is just post the evidence. Let us take a look at it, and then we'll use our own critical analysis and judge it against the other scholarship that's out there. That's how we do our work. It would be nice if I could just say anything and no one challenged it, and I don't want to embarrass myself. So I need to make sure that my scholarship is undergirded with empiricism, evidence, facts, and stories.
Jubilee, you had something? Thank you, Dr. Brown.
No, I was just gonna just point out the fact, and not to go back and forth, but Fahima brought up the fact that African Ancestry is the first one, and they use the database that comes out of the Human Genome Project. If you research the Human Genome Project, you'll see that there's a lot of controversy and a lot of immoral things that go into that. They are trying to support the idea that phenotypes are associated with certain regions of the world, and that's just not how it works. Even with you saying they have the largest African DNA database, that really doesn't mean anything. You have to understand how they get that DNA. It's not like they're taking scoops of the dirt in Africa and putting in a machine that says, oh, your DNA matches with this landmass. No, they're taking samples from people whose ancestors may or may not have been there for a lot amount of time, and trying to compare it with ours. And that just doesn't work. You can't tell where you are from ancestrally. You can only go back about 5, 6 generations, which is relevant to our epigenetics. So I think we really got to understand how they do this stuff instead of just saying they have the largest database.
Okay, I don't mean to do a go back and forth. If I may, Dr. Brown, he used the information gleaned from his work on the Human Genome Project and the African Burial Ground. I posted their website in the timeline, so I would just encourage you to go and look at their website so you'll have an understanding of what they do. That what you just stated is not actually accurate. He used the information gleaned from working on these two very important historical projects.
Unless you
Hold on, guys.
truly
Hold on.
understand.
Hold on. Let me go. And this is the last point I'm gonna make on this because we ain't none of us no DNA experts. But I will say this, and I said this earlier. Sampling is important where you get your samples from for comparison. And sometimes people's religious beliefs are such that they won't provide the materials to be a part of a human genome project. I know with my father and in my family, blood transfusions, we wasn't with that. And if I ever have to have one, I've always said I want it to be from my own family member. And I remember my father used to talk about this scripture. It says the life is in the blood. So he was always kind of anti giving up bodily materials for any kind of, uh, medical or doctoral thing that wasn't absolutely necessary. I don't think that I'm unusual in that regard because of the history of medical apartheid. So when you start talking about things like human genome projects, you have to look at the sample and how credible that sample is as it relates to the overall population that might be used in these comparisons.
Yeah, I would argue that this is a reparations space for Black Americans here in the United States, and anything beyond these shores is absolutely utterly irrelevant to what we're doing for reparations. And I can't stress that anymore. It's great if people want to reach out and find their roots. That's wonderful, but there is absolutely no need for finding. Um, Not even anything. I mean, even European, whether European, Asian, South American, African, none of that matters. The immediate family and the is in this case for medical histories, the people that we can reach, those are the people that matter. Beyond that, it's a waste of
Well,
energy.
I don't want to be that harsh, Michael. I mean, we did call it your roots. So, but it's just that we have kind of bounded our perspective as it relates to the role of, medicine and in terms of that DNA question that I asked, we bounded it within the context of reparations for American descendants of slaves. But I mean, science is always evolving and information is always changing. I never want to discourage anyone from learning. And I don't want you to feel like, your question wasn't worthy of asking because it certainly was.
But I get the general point is that our co-host is it Mike? I want to make sure I got it. Is it okay?
Yes,
You
ma'am.
know what, I get the point. What Mike is saying is that what is happening, what happened on this shore is very important. But someone told me this because I was like you, Mike, very on a hardcore. Like I didn't want to talk about Africa until I just didn't want to talk about it. I only wanted to talk about my ancestors here. And then somebody told me, if you're so focused on your ancestors here, why? I mean, of course you have to be focused on your ancestors on the continent, and they're still your ancestors, and they, she was so right, and that kind of just made me think about it. But to your point, we, for reparation purposes, we definitely need to focus on our ancestors here. But I love evidence, and I don't want to throw away any evidence. So if we can get information about who our ancestors were on the shore, on the continent, then yes, I want to know. I want to know where those folks came from, where they were kidnapped, where they, I want to know about those places, because that is very important. Again, I need to know who I am. And if my ancestor came from Senegal, my ancestor came from, Nigeria or Angola, I want to know that. So I just want to, I want to take both of those ideas and give you both high fives, because they are both very, very important.
And I also want to be careful too that we keep the language correct. Everybody wasn't kidnapped. Some people were sold and traded. So let's be honest about that as well.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad that this has been such a great conversation, and I really just wanted to back up. Um, uh, oh gosh, I'm sorry, Dr. McDowell's point that they didn't bring slaves from Africa. They brought people who had their own talents that you can probably see if you talk to. I also encourage you to talk to your grandparents and your great grandparents, the aunties. We have, if you have a family reunion, it's, my family, we have family reunions. We like to party, but you also have to talk to your elders and ask those questions. I mean, when I think about the way that my grandfather fished, the way that my father and grandfather really loves to work with wood, all those things, farmers, the farming communities, that they were brought here not just because they were bodies, but because they had knowledge. When I think about my ancestors, so when you think about your ancestors here in the US, having some context about where they came from is only going to help you and help you understand why you are the way you are. And even when we were talking earlier about the family members who have kidney disease, now there is a genetic marker that is more prevalent in people of African descent with kidney disease. It doesn't mean that it's because they're black, but there is a genetic trait that can be traced back to the continent. So just a reminder that as we talk about slavery and enslavement, that we are still talking about people, we are talking about our ancestors who had gifts and beauty that we still see in ourselves today.
That's true, Dr. Bentley, because there are whites who have sickle cell anemia, and that was an immune response to malaria that was prevalent in Africa. So again, we get into the complexity of, human biology, but, there is no necessarily race gene that defines you as black, white, Italian, or anything like that. But because we can make those same claims about skills that may have been a result of you having a Native American ancestor who was proficient in medicine, and or you can have somebody who was a European ancestor. We just have such a complex history in the United States in terms of the involuntary copulation and offspring we were forced to produce as well, and those associated epigenetic factors that may have come into play into who we are and who our relatives have become in the United States.
Yeah, yeah. Also, I want to make sure that I don't have anything against the continent. I lived on the continent for almost a decade, and I just want to make it. I just want to be. I want to assure that we are concentrating on our people here, concentrating on our history here. And I think as one of the things that Dr. Darity mentions as detours is we within this reparations fight, because this is where we are. I think this is where we need to concentrate. Now, what everybody's history and their history back to the continent, or back to any continent for that matter, is their business, and it is an excellent marker for fashioning their worldview, right? And I've read the book Exchanging Our Country Marks, which was I forget the author name is Gomez, which talks about how African people were selected for their particular skill sets that we never get that the continent never gets credit for. And I agree that that needs to change. My point is I'm sorry, my dogs are going crazy out here. The purposes of for this conversation is that we should be in a space where we're dealing with what's here, because this is what we need to tackle. My 2 cents. I'm not the scholar here. I'm just saying.
Well, I guess I go back to the fact that I'm a mixed methodologist. I have a tendency to deal with complexity. It is Black History Month, so we did make a little space for that. But you're right. Our focus is this book that we produced and the chapters that we contributed to them. And so the focus has been on those Black Americans who are descendants of slaves, the formerly enslaved, and those persons that we have come to, in my case, term U.S. freedmen. So, yes, absolutely. But I encourage anyone as an adult educator to do your research about your family history the best that you can. Were there any other questions? I always wonder if my room is ever gonna be long enough. So I went an hour and a half, and I'm just super excited because I thought we'd be in here 15 minutes. But does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, I'm so glad we didn't have no technical problems, Michael. What? We must have had a really nice title that they didn't want to sabotage it.
You are my hero. It's all
Okay,
because of
I
you.
think Buffalo coming up. Okay, Buffalo. Michael gonna let you in because I don't know what I'm doing.
And Dr. Brown,
Sorry,
I am actually going to go ahead and log off because I have little people to attend to. But thank you all for listening and joining us. But I've been told that my time is
Thank
up.
you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, please follow
Before
me
you
and I'll
leave,
follow
ma'am,
you. I'll follow you back.
before you leave, ma'am, hi, Dr. Brown and Mike. I just have a really quick question. This was a great space. I appreciate it. Um, Lots of harm happens in the medical realm, so it's awesome that you all are addressing these issues. And I had just heard, and I just wanted to ask who it was that was speaking. I had heard, and congratulations on your new grandbaby expecting, Dr. Brown. In that conversation, when you were talking about it, there was some conversation about midwives and doulas being explained. And I just wanted to because I was distracted but listening, and so I just wanted to verify which person on stage was given that information, that very valuable information.
Yes, that was me, Dr. Bentley Edwards. Yeah,
I gave you a follow, so I
thank you.
appreciate you contributing to the space, both of you. It's great space.
Absolutely, and depending on what city you're in, there are a lot more. Black folks who are coming together to improve outcomes for birth and for babies and parents, both mothers and fathers. And so is a push for more Black doulas and training programs. And so, depending on, I think Medicare now covers doula. So if you have pregnancy Medicaid, I'm sorry, Medicaid, if you have pregnancy Medicaid, it will cover a midwife, and in most states, it will cover a doula. So don't only think about it as something, for rich white ladies, that this is something that is much more accessible now than it was even, 7, 8 years ago.
That's great information. My children are all grown now. I won't be in that situation, but I would like to reach out to you, have a conversation if that's okay.
That's fine. I'm easy to find.
Well, again, thank everybody for coming. I don't see nobody else in the queue. Is anybody else in there, Michael?
No, nobody else is
Okay.
in the queue. It's just Buffalo
Well,
poaching.
again, reminder
Buffalo
that
here poaching gets for her space.
okay. Or again, a reminder that our last Black History Month event with all the authors is next Monday, 6 o'clock. Oh Lord, 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 7 o'clock Central Standard Time, where I'm at. And I hope all y'all come back and join us again. Bye, everybody. Have a great Sunday.
Thank you.
So
Thank
long,
you.
everybody.